You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 250 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Joining me on today's show is the unofficial co-host and most frequent guest of the show, Will Porter. Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm pretty sure everybody knows you and your credentials, but if you don't, he is a freelance journalist and his work specializes in the U.S. foreign policy and Mideast affairs. He reads books on all these things and really takes the time to research everything. His work has been published many places, including the Daily Sheeple, Consortiumnews.com, antiwar.com, and of course the best place to go to find Will's work, I would say, just because all my stuff is there too, is libertarianinstitute.org. So if everybody goes to the Libertarian Institute's homepage there, you can find my daily news roundup. Will's work is featured in the blog section and in the featured articles. You have an author page there that I will link to on the show notes page, and then the podcast section there, Foreign Policy Focus, you'll find that there on the homepage. And so you could click and share this episode that me and Will are doing for you here. On today's show, got Will on the show, episode 250, which, you know, again, thank you to all my listeners who are sharing the show, because I really wouldn't have thought when I started the show that I would do, you know, a quarter of a way to 1,000 episodes. And I got Will on for the special episode because I think we're going to do a pretty cool review of one of my favorite shows that I did with Will, and that is of Trump's national security strategy. For a president, this is kind of what they lay out to say what their foreign policy goals, objectives, and to some extent they explain kind of the methods that they're going to do this. And me and Will really looked through this very long document the Trump administration put out and did a lot of research on it. And one of the main goals and takeaways that me and Will had from that national security strategy is that the United States is going to look to combat the kind of great powers of Russia and China, who the United States said are trying to create a world order outside of the United States world order and look to challenge the United States around the world. And so I thought this would be a great time, probably like 9 months after it's put out, to evaluate how Trump is doing in achieving that goal. And I don't think me and Will, and I'll link to that episode in the show notes page, but me and Will kind of explained that we don't necessarily agree that combating Russia and China is like some big grand security need of the United States of America. And if the U.S. isn't working at all times to prevent the rise of Russia and China, we'll all be speaking Chinese in 10 years. But at the same time, it is interesting to look at Trump's foreign policy and evaluate it against what he says it's intended to do. So, Will, I guess I'll let you start here just by adding anything that you think is important about the national security strategy and, just general Trump's policy.
Yeah, sure. So I think this strategy kind of represents like a shift. Like in the world post 2001, a lot of American foreign policy has sort of been oriented around like, counterterrorism and stuff. And so this strategy like explicitly says we're shifting away from this counterterrorism stuff to like great power rivalries and competitions. And so it's sort of more of like a Cold War footing, with these large powers like Russia and China. And so that's sort of that's like the posture, that's the disposition of the administration. And yeah, we should look and see what the result has been so far.
On the last show, I discussed a little bit about how the United States policy in Venezuela and Iran was pushing those countries into China's orbit a little bit. It really focused on China for that show. But on this show, the focus is going to be Russia. And starting off with a news story that's come out in recent days that caught some headlines, in part because it really plays up on the Trump ego, and that is Poland is offering the United States $2 billion to open up a U.S. base in Poland. I think this base is supposed to have like a tank unit or something like that in it. It would be a good number of U.S. troops. Now, it would never be enough U.S. troops to actually repel a Russian invasion, should, the Russians decide, Vladimir Putin wakes up one morning with a crazy brain tumor or something and, the ghost of Stalin, his spirit takes over Putin's body and he tries to roll back through Poland. These troops really can't do anything to stop it. And, it's more or less just going to be a tripwire. That way the United States is going to say, look, Russia just killed 10,000 U.S. troops in Poland and we have to do something about it right now. Probably nuclear war. So Will, what do you have on, what's the United States doing in Poland? Is there really a threat that, Vladimir Putin is going to become the new Stalin and invade Poland? And, what do you think overall of, Fort Trump? I guess that they even floated the name.
Yeah, like, as you said, like any force the United States is going to put there as like a forward presence in Poland, that's not going to stop. If Russia, decided, as a lot of these pundits are suggesting, they decided to roll over the Baltics or roll over Eastern Europe, having, this base there is not going to do much in terms of like actual military, reality. But yeah, as you say, they're floating this idea of building this new thing called Fort Trump, and I think the Polish government has offered $2 billion for that. And so I find that to be kind of interesting. Like a big theme in Trump's sort of like rhetoric is often that people aren't paying enough, and so I guess maybe this is to appease him there. They're putting up $2 billion for this thing. But I mean, like U.S. policy toward Poland, Poland I think is seen as sort of like a sensitive or important like buffer state, because the U.S. has before like placed Patriot missile batteries there. Now, I think the one we had in there was a training battery, and we had like 100 soldiers stationed, like accompanying it. But at one point, this battery was stationed in, it was like 50 miles away from the little Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. And so like these policies in Poland, these forward operating, stances in Poland can be kind of provocative, I think, toward the Russians.
Right. And just to add on to this, I think it's interesting that it really seems Poland maybe has, at least the Polish government, has the idea that they have Trump marked, that offering the United States this, what really is a token amount of money when you look at what the United States is going to pay, the troops that are deployed there, what they're going to end up paying every year to operate that base, repairs, and, just the cost to build it originally. I don't think that $2 billion is going to be like some boon to the U.S. Treasury or anything like that. I'm pretty sure we blow through $2 billion in like a half hour or something. And naming it Fort Trump, right? So they're really going after and think that Trump it's definitely easily seduced by playing up his ego. And I'll be really interested to know if we start to see Trump pushing for this base and wanting it built. Because if it does, then maybe he's a little bit of an easier market than I took.
Right. Yeah. And I think the Polish state has also been pushing for, because like currently they're already American soldiers there. I think a couple thousand actually in Poland. And they're trying to push for that to be increased. So I'm interested to see what Trump does there too.
So, well, as we've seen NATO expansion, one of the reactionary things that we've seen from Russia is Russia to be more concerned about the United States expanding all the way to Ukraine and Georgia. And we've, had for years now thoughts of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO and pushed by, high-ranking officials in, I think, pretty much every U.S. government. This wasn't something like unique to the Bush government or the Clinton government or the Obama government. And there's certainly people in the Trump government that like this plan to include these countries into NATO. So I think here's where we're going to see, and I know these policies will have come under the Bush and Obama administrations in Georgia and the U.S., but we're going to see that Trump has continued these same policies, even though I'm going to have Will explain in a second that they've actually caused Russia to gain influence and spread influence and not lose influence. So, Will, do you want to explain what happened in Ukraine that led to an increase of influence for Russia?
Yeah, sure. First thing I'll say, too, is just that, like, the NATO expansion toward Russia eastward across Eastern Europe has been a steady thing, marching forward. So this has been a major concern for the Russians. But one of the most recent examples of this, or, like, at least sort of in that orbit of phenomena, was the Russian annexation of Crimea. And that was provoked, however, by very provocative American policies. The United States gave heavy support, and we've talked about this on your show, heavy support for the Euromaidan coup movement, which, led as it was by these neo-Nazi groups, the Azov Battalion and Right Sector and those types of groups. And we basically helped this movement oust the president there, Viktor Yanukovych. And right after that, right after this president is ousted, a bunch of former Ukrainian presidents come out and they call on the new, post-coup government to rescind what was called the Kharkiv Pact, which gave Russia access to this super important naval base in Crimea. And so sort of as a response to that, the Russians then annexed Crimea, and then the Crimeans voted in a referendum to, leave Ukraine. However, we can see all of that was completely started and caused and provoked by American policies, by this Euromaidan protest movement that we backed so heavily. And so, actions have reactions and consequences, and the Russian annexation of Crimea, I think was a sort of direct consequence of our policies in Ukraine.
Right. And the thing important to the Trump foreign policy, I guess, because that's what we're really trying to do here is evaluate that, is that Trump has continued the policy of backing the Kiev government, the, once coup government, now ruling most of Ukraine. There is still the area in eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, which is now part of Russia, that Kiev government doesn't rule, but they rule most of Ukraine. And we're giving them lethal aid under the Trump administration, something that we didn't do under Obama. But it seems clear that if Trump's national security strategy called for the United States to pivot and start to focus on the great powers, that Trump should have done something different than what Obama did, because Obama's policy clearly increased the literal area of Russia. That they actually, ended up with the Crimean Peninsula, the Crimeans wanting to join Russia and doing so because of the U.S. policy there. So rather than the Trump administration coming in and saying, we're going to do the exact opposite of what Obama did, we're going to stop supporting the Kiev government, and the people of Ukraine could have a vote, and if the people of Crimea want to come back to Ukraine and participate in the presidential elections, they could certainly do so, and, let them then argue with the Russians about, leaving and or just going back to the Sevastopol military base there. So I think, the important part for the show here, Will, is just that, this policy under Trump has been a complete continuation and expansion of the Obama policy.
Yeah, it's interesting how often Trump tries to sort of, at least he did do this a lot in the first year of his campaign or of his presidency, that how he tries to define himself sort of in opposition to Obama. So especially on things like the Iran deal. But here on the Ukraine question, he's just doubling down on basically Obama's same policy. And specifically, they're selling these Javelin missiles to the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainians are using them in a war against these Russian-speaking separatists in the east, and in the east of Ukraine. And sort of that conflict has been drawing in Russia also into the eastern side of Ukraine too. Like, I'm not sure exactly to what extent. I think maybe some of this little green men stuff gets kind of overblown, but definitely it's drawing Russia into the Ukrainian conflict. The continued American support for this thing that keeps it going.
Right, and I'm sure the people of eastern Ukraine would be much less happy about having Russian military, to whatever extent it is, operating within their country if they weren't under attack from their own government. So, I'm sure that has a big part to do with the happiness of them coming in. To quickly go over Georgia, the United States was backing a government intervention in that country with, I believe, the Georgian government looking to move into an area, South Odessa, that was actually protected by Russian peacekeepers. They attacked the Russian peacekeepers. Putin comes in and then, just annexes that limited amount of area and, quite literally, again, expanding Russia by a few, I think, 100 square miles in that case. So, I don't know, Will, if you have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, I would just say that, I think the way the U.S. often likes to operate is just like a zero-sum game. Like, we get everything we want or else, or all or nothing. But they fail to often think about, what kind of piecemeal outcomes will this have? It's not going to be that Russia is defeated and ceases to be a nation. What will they do if you try to back the Georgians? Well, they might annex some territory or something. And I think American policymakers in any administration recently have not really considered these things.
Right. And they continue to push for Georgia to become a NATO member, something that Russia has drawn a red line around. And I'm sure from Russia's point of view, looking at what continues to happen in Europe, where the United States comes in, uses, kind of soft power influences, spreading money, NGOs around to try to get favorable governments elected into these Eastern European countries, and then pushing for them to become NATO members. And so, recent additions, Montenegro and Macedonia have now come into NATO. And I'm sure that makes Russia concerned and makes, Russia expand a lot more, kind of soft power in this area. I'm sure with Belarus, with Georgia, and with Ukraine, that Russia's just so concerned now about these, red line countries joining NATO that they have to, pour more of and try to create more pro-Russia sentiment in those countries.
Yeah, no doubt.
All right. Now let's move on to Syria, Will. And I guess, to kind of just talk generally about how the Obama policy in Syria eventually draws Russia into the country in 2015.
Yeah, sure. Did you want me just to summarize that basically?
Yeah, just as much time as you need to summarize.
Okay, sure, yeah. So the American CIA was pouring tons of weapons into the Syrian opposition, the rebel opposition. And in 2015, this started to really have like real outcomes, like real visible outcomes. And these rebels who had been armed with all these like anti-tank tow missiles and stuff started making real gains up into the north of Syria, up into Idlib and Latakia and stuff. And it was this big rebel offensive that in the spring of 2015 that actually provoked Russian involvement. It was this like big successful offensive by these rebels. And like Russia had been sort of involved before that as an advisor, but this is when Russia really gets involved with its air force and its military and like it's fully in the conflict.
Right. And so then you have Assad and Russia, had a standing alliance that I believe went bad through his father. But now you have thousands of Russian troops running all around Syria, carrying out operations, and there's Russian weapons all over the place. And I'm sure a lot of the infrastructure of the country is being rebuilt by Russia. And so, you just have all this additional Russia influence in Syria created by the Obama policy. But then you have Trump take office, and he does one thing that I think is actually generally in support of his grand policy of, being more concerned about Russia, and that is he ends the CIA arming and funding of the Syrian rebel groups. And, this would be a policy that would actually strengthen Assad and make Assad less reliant on Russia. But then, Will, I guess, do you want to point out some of his other policies that pretty much go directly against this plan?
Yeah, sure. Like, where do we start? Like we could point at the several times that the Trump administration has bombed, not Russia specifically, although there was one incident where we bombed Russian mercenaries. However, yeah, there's been all these incidents with the chemical weapons allegations that have led to, Americans bombing Syrian targets. And in doing all this, like, certainly you risk hurting Russian soldiers or hitting Russian assets or whatever. And so, yeah, I would say that by, basically going to war with Russia's direct ally here in Syria, that's a very sort of contradictory policy.
Right. Bombing Assad's been a big one. We protected the rebels at Al-Tanaf. And now, as Assad's going in and looking at defeating the, rest of the Syrian rebels there, at least, the non-Kurdish Syria rebels in the Idlib province, you have the entire Trump administration, including Donald Trump himself, threatening Assad and Russia, telling them not to do it. And so, again, you would think the goal here would be, for Russia to waste their time and resources, killing off all the jihadists for you. And then you have a situation where Assad doesn't need Russia quite so much anymore. And, then maybe the U.S. could even look to expand influence into Syria. But instead, we're trying to protect these rebels, which is just going to expand the need for Russia to be involved in Syria and be reliant on Assad. It's also worth mentioning here that the United States has a lot of sanctions against the Assad regime, and the Trump administration continues to state that their policy is that rebuilding efforts and aid from the United States, and I believe many of our Western allies are committed onto this, that's not going to go to benefit the Assad regime. I think it was a big deal when France sent just a few $1 million of medical aid into Assad-held Syria. And so, again, you're going to create a situation where the only countries available to rebuild Syria are going to be countries like Russia and Iran. And while the Trump administration, wants to curb the influence of these countries, actually what they're going to do is, commit these countries to Syria. It's also going to be a pretty easy propaganda campaign, to endear, Russia and Syria, or Russia and Iran to the Syrian people by saying that, look, the United States and their allies are saying that it's illegal to help you, but we're going to do it, and, we're going to be happy to do so. And I don't know, Will, if you had anything to add on.
Yeah, I mean,
that.
if you're just going to alienate, the more countries that we alienate in the world, the more foreign powers that we alienate, we just leave those, I hate using the term enemy or adversary or whatever, but you just leave those countries then wide open to your adversaries to go and develop and, to have trade relations with. And so really, I don't think it's this is a bad strategy, a bad, overall disposition toward the rest of the world.
Now, in Syria, aside from the conflict with the Sunni rebels, you have the Syrian Kurds, and the United States, under the Trump administration, really has said that they're staying put with soldiers in Syria and Kurdistan, and it seems that they're going to continue to arm and train and help the Syrian Kurds. And this is a huge problem for the U.S. NATO ally Turkey, who sees the Syrian Kurds as a terrorist group. And so, Will, do you want to talk a little bit how this U.S. policy of backing the Syrian Kurds has continued well through, and I think even probably expanded a little bit under the Trump administration, has driven a NATO ally in Turkey pretty much into the hands of Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, it's really been fascinating to watch the Turkish role in the whole Syrian conflict. Because if you'll recall, just a few years ago, there was that whole, Turkish shoot down of a Russian jet. And it seemed like, wow, they're completely on opposite sides. But since then, the U.S., the Department of Defense started backing what's called the Syrian Democratic Forces, this Kurdish group, mostly led by the YPG in Syria. And that has been a major problem for Turkey. Turkey is not happy about that. And so I think that's sort of driven them much more, more into the orbit of Russia and sort of trying to work with, the Russia, Assad, Iran orbit. I mean, even then, I think there's still tensions. You do still have Turkish presence in northern Syria and stuff. That's kind of not. I don't think Assad is perfectly happy with that. However, I do think that that Erdogan has worked out some stuff between the Russians and the Syrians of where he can be without being too offensive or whatever. And so certainly this policy of insisting on backing the Kurds as our proxy, that has absolutely dictated what's going to happen with Turkey. Turkey, we definitely knew, American policymakers knew from the get-go what sort of response they would get from Turkey.
Yeah, and some of the big markers of this growing Putin influence is that when Erdogan wanted to remove the Syrian Kurds from the Afrin province, which was a Kurdish enclave in Syria, he went to Vladimir Putin and was able to have enough of a relationship with Vladimir Putin to remove the Russian presence from this Afrin area of Syria, so Turkey could go and bomb and invade and brutally kill a bunch of Kurdish civilians. You also have the S-400 missile system. Is Turkey buying an S-400 or an S-500? I think it's a 400 missile system from Russia, and this is a big deal because that means that Turkey will not be able to tie into the rest of the NATO air defense system.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's another source of tension here is that the Turks are going to pivot away from our missile or our weapons, our machinery, which is a huge sort of carrot and stick that we carry around that, hey, if you want our weapons, then you better, sort of behave or stay in line. But yeah, certainly, the support for the Kurds is driving the Turks way away from our orbit.
Right. To move on, Will, it's maybe hard to pick the worst part of Trump's foreign policy out. But for me, it's hard not to pick the withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear agreement. Coming into Trump's administration, there was really no reason that the United States wasn't going to be able to get along with Iran, and that, a practical look at Syria that Trump had, couldn't say that we could team up with Iran, Assad, and Russia and Syria to fight and kill ISIS and then be done with the situation once all the jihadists are gone. But instead, from pretty much the get-go, Trump has taken a very hawkish stance against Iran. A big move has been the appointment of Mike Pompeo, first to the CIA director and then to Secretary of State. He is, I believe, ideologically anti-Iran. His personal religious beliefs lead him to being anti-Muslim and anti-Iran. And he is a strong believer that there's a problem with the Iranians. He's also appointed now John Bolton to be National Security Advisor. So, with the withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal, Trump has really driven Iran out of what could have been an inclusion in Iran into kind of the Western markets and the Western orbit. So Will, do you want to talk a little bit where I guess Iran has gone in reaction to, the isolation from the West?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's pretty clear that Iran wants to be in from the cold. They want to do business with the West. I mean, they had several European firms that have had to close up shop. And so prior to that, they wanted to do business with Europe. There's German automotive companies and French shippers and there's a lot of big concerns that are having to pull out because of this. And so, yeah, certainly what this does is it's sort of like, all the countries that are in the American orbit are way more sensitive to going along with the sanctions, because they have more at stake there, as opposed to maybe like China or something, who's a little more independent and who sort of like maybe even has some carrots and sticks held over the U.S. Because China has certainly insisted that they're not going to go along with the oil sanctions, and they kick in I think November. I think that's when they're supposed to be implemented. And so certainly what we're seeing here is sort of like how this is shaping up is like the Russia-China bloc seems more willing to continue dealing with Iran, and so we're just pushing them into their arms. Now with Russia specifically, they actually seem to be kind of taking advantage of this. Like as we see Iranian like exports fall, and we see certain countries like Greece and Italy and Turkey sort of like reduce their imports of Iranian oil, we see them going over to the Russians. And I think this has even caused like Iranian officials to sort of complain, like, hey, Russia, like you're kind of kicking us while we're down here. But nonetheless, what this is doing is sort of like screwing up, trade relations between countries. It's making Iran more isolated and making them, it certainly is altering like the blocks, the power blocks in the world, and not in our favor.
Well, right. And the United States has expressed concern about European powers being too reliant on Russia for energy needs. And yet here again, you have a policy where, you could have a friendly Iran that's exporting a ton of energy very cheaply to Western powers rather than Russia doing it or Iran exporting the oil and stuff to China. And so it's very interesting, the whole dynamics it creates now where you're going to have European countries more reliant on Russia for energy rather than less reliant. And again, just increasing Russia's influence.
Yeah, let's just say here too that this does not help us. Like our companies here in America can't do business with Iran because of these sanctions. It's not the only benefit you could possibly see here is some kind of like, and you have to believe in the political theory behind it, is like a geopolitical one, is like isolating Iran. And if you see that as a good thing, that's the only possible benefit. Otherwise, we're losing business, and it's, ultimately making the world a, less peaceful place, making it more a hostile place.
All right, well, so we've, talked about several countries in this show, but, kind of specifically Russia, Syria, Turkey, China, and how this kind of Trump foreign policy in its practical form, what's actually happening on the ground is rather than, bringing countries like Turkey closer into NATO and closer into the alliance and looking for, Iran to be less reliant on Russia and more tied into the West, more committed to not having nuclear weapons. And in Syria, creating situations where the jihadists are easily and quickly killed. We seem to have done the opposite overall. So I guess, you're somebody who read the whole national security strategy that Donald Trump put out, and you follow the foreign policy pretty much every day. Do you find any indication that Trump seems to like maybe some of like his actions, like the intended outcome is what's in the national security strategy, but practically, has he really done anything to achieve any of those ends?
Certainly not. Like, if the end is to put America in a place of strength and dominance and superiority in terms of geopolitics, that has not been the outcome. And that's sort of the stated outcome, or the stated motive, or the stated purpose in the strategy. Now, if you listen to Trump's like rhetoric, just sort of like him going off the cuff or talking on stage to his constituents or to reporters or whatever, it sounds like he wants to get along with Russia. And so that's another like motive that you can't quite square with the outcome. So whether he wants to be, have better relations with Russia or whether he wants to completely dominate them strategically, in either case, we're not seeing those outcomes. What we're really seeing is just more of often, honestly, the same kind of outcomes of American foreign policy. Sort of bumbling, giving our enemies and adversaries influence while at the same time blowing all these tax dollars, killing all these civilians, etc. It's really no different.
I must say, when I do look at Trump's foreign policy from this angle and not seeming to understand even the Kissinger foreign policy of, trying to like use Russia against China or China against Russia and, and looking to like kind of have one of those superpowers as, a somewhat allied or state, or at least, like friendly-ish state with the United States. It's very interesting that it seems like pretty much everything Trump is doing, including, this very recent news story, Will, I guess that, we can mention, that China, I guess, purchased some missiles and planes from Russia, and in response, the Trump administration sanctioned a Chinese military agency responsible for procuring, different arms and whatever for the Chinese government. And so I'm sure that's actually problematic. Because, since this is the agency that goes out and buys everything, with all these little weapon parts and everything, the economy being so global, I'm sure China's reliant, on other countries for different, weapons or parts or stuff like that. And I'm sure some of those countries fall under purview of U.S. sanctions. And, this will actually be problematic for China. And we're seeing China, get pretty aggressive, at least rhetorically, about this, saying that the United States, needs to undo these sanctions or bear the consequences.
Yeah. And China, I don't think they're not kidding. They actually have the ability to enforce some of these threats or whatever. They're not just like a paper tiger entirely. So I don't know, as much as the United States wants to try to live in this unipolar world where it's the only power, only superpower, I think the more we try to do this, the more aggressively we try to hold on to this, we're other countries are chafing under this. We're sort of forcing them into their own orbit. We're forcing them into an oppositional orbit. And it doesn't have to be that way, but we are insisting on doing it.
And it'll be very interesting, Will, to see what happens in the coming years, what these countries try to do as the United States. I mean, we're sanctioning everybody now. The Trump administration, in particular, at least seems to me, that their policy is just to sanction people in countries that they don't like, whether it's Nicaragua, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran. They pit people with ties to the government, businesses with ties to the government, and they sanction. And eventually, I'm guessing that these, people are all going to start to get together and say, well, how do we beat the sanctions? And I'm sure at that time they're going to come up with some kind of method. And maybe that means the US dollar not being the world reserve currency, or, different kinds of things like, maybe Turkey leaving NATO. But certainly I'm guessing that there's going to be a breaking point when it becomes very clear that, there's at least a coalition force willing to challenge the U.S. unipolar moment.
We're basically encouraging other countries to conspire against us in a way.
Right, they have to feed each other. I mean, I don't know, Will, if you caught this. I think it was happening this morning. We're recording this the day before it comes out. The MEK summit, you have Rudy Giuliani bragging that, Iranian people are selling their organs to prevent themselves from starving to death. And that's, kind of a feature of the U.S. sanctions against Iran. I believe it was Rex Tillerson who said that, the starving, North Koreans washing up in Japan shows that the sanctions are starting to bite. They're starting to take effect. Of course, you go all the way back to Madeleine Albright under, Clinton, and her saying that 500,000 Iraqi children dying from American sanctions is worth it. And again, this shows that, the starvation is a feature of the sanctions. And so it's not like if the United States sanctions Iran, they're just preventing the Ayatollah, from getting access to sports cars or something like that. These sanctions have real effects and they really starve people to death. And so, people are going to have, look for real solutions to get around these sanctions. And I think the more people in more countries the United States puts in this category of, we're going to sanction you, the more we're going to drive them together. And I don't think a lot of these, countries are natural allies or anything like that. But I'm sure, if it's between starving to death or, being economically crippled because of U.S. sanctions or getting along with somebody you really don't like, you're going to get along with the person trying not to starve you.
It's like a real friendship in a foxhole there.
All right. Well, do we have anything else to say about, the national security strategy, especially in its relationship with Russia, and how it seems the Trump administration has really failed in whatever kind of goal it had in, preventing the, great powers from
I guess
rising.
I'd just take a second to make the point that, like, you're going to hear a lot about Donald Trump about how he's so easy on Russia and how he's actually, he's just like a big, he loves Putin and he's, not doing anything to make Russia pay for what they've done or anything. Well, certainly that's not true. Trump has tried, at least, to do a lot of hostile things to Russia. Expelling diplomats, the nuclear posture review, killing Russian mercenaries, sanctions, all these things. However, as we say, just the outcomes of these things has not been to put us in a stronger place. But certainly the outcome has been to make relations worse with the Russians.
Right. And I guess, it just before I close out, there have been like the slight positives, like the Helsinki summit and the fact that Donald Trump has expressed on some occasions that he would like to get along better with Russia. But looking practically at what has happened as a result of the decision, the consequences from the U.S. foreign policy actions, just continuing to drive Russia and, this kind of global, group of countries that are outside of, kind of the U.S. world order in club together. So, Will, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Tell everybody where they can find your work.
Thank you for having me. You guys can find my work at consortiumnews.com, the libertarianinstitute.org in the blog, and sometimes in the featured articles section at antiwar.com. And I have a large archive at a site called The Daily Sheeple. If you want to find me on Twitter, you can find me at WKP_ANCAP, ANCAP. And if you really like what I do and want to support me, you can find me at patreon.com/WKPjournalist.
All right. And you can find this show at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org. Facebook is Libertarian Union. Twitter is at KYAAALE. And if you really like the show and you want to help support it, better equipment, more interviews, stuff like that, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.